Hello everybody, and welcome to part 3 of my How to Make a Card Game and GameMaker series. In the last video, we worked on drawing the deck and drawing cards and keeping a center focal point for our hand so that it looks a little more professional when we draw from our deck. Now, in this video, we are going to be working on creating these animations. So this would be the start of our game. It will be drawing the prize cards out first and then drawing from our hand. And in the next video, we will work on being able to set these cards onto the field, and we will begin adding in the necessary information in order to play with these cards. For instance, their name, their health points, their attacks, and things like that. So if you're interested in the series and you haven't seen the first 2 videos, I recommend following the series from the beginning. And if you want to follow along, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, hit the like button. It makes me feel happy. So from the last video, there's a few changes I want to make. The first one's going to be this object hand. So in the last video, we created the create event and the draw event. Now, what I want to do is I want to change the name of this object from object hand to object player, because I want to have all of the information that represents a player in one object. So instead of having one object for the hand and one object for the deck, I'm going to combine them into one. Now, I'm still going to keep this deck object because I want to maintain the left released and other aspects of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy all of these variables from this object and put it in this create object. I'm also going to remove this because we no longer need it because it's initialized at the top. And then I'm going to delete all of these variables from this object because they no longer need it. Because what we're going to do is we're going to attach this object to the player object. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to create this variable. We're going to set player equal to object player. Now what that will allow us to do is from this object connect any variable from the player object to this object like we did in the previous video. So what I'm going to do here is, since I created this variable, I'm going to change this code, this line of code, to with player draw the card. And I'm doing this because all of these variables are now in the object player event. So I need to be in the player object to do this script. So I'm also going to have to change the code in here because if you remember, we connected the deck object to the hand object using this line of code or this notation before any variable that belonged to that object. So what we're going to do is, you see it's blue now when before it was red. That's because we changed this object name to player. So what I want to do is I want to remove all of these notations from this script. So I'm going to highlight the entire script. I'm going to hit Control F. I'm going to find everything that says object hand, period, and then I'm going to replace it with nothing. So I removed them all from this script. So if you look here now, I don't need to notate that it's from a different object because all of these variables are in the player object because I used this function, the with function. Now I also have to do the same to this event. since these variables are no longer in this object, so like in the other event, I'm going to add this line of code with player and the curly brackets, and I want to indent all of this. So if I highlight it and I hit the tab button, it will indent it all for me. If I wanted to indent it the other way, I can hit Shift Tab to go left, and if I wanted it to go right, I'll just hit Tab. And the next event we have to change is the step event. So in order to tie these variables to the player object, instead of doing the with function like I did in the last ones, I will just add the notation player period before each variable that belongs in that object. And with this script, I will use the with function. So now everything should act the same way it did before. All we did was change an object name and tie the deck object, or we tied the player object to the deck object. So let's see if this still works. So I should be able to draw from the deck still, and it still works. Now let's see if I can still shuffle the deck. That still works without crashing the game. So everything is as it should be. Now, one thing I want to do anytime I create a program in GameMaker for if I'm ever troubleshooting, I always want to restart the game or make a way to restart the game in case I ever want to go back to the beginning. So before we proceed, I'm going to add that line of code. So I'll do that in the deck event, and you want to add this line of code in whatever object will always be in the game. You can do it to a separate object, you can do it to an object you know will always be there, like the player object. I'm going to do it in the deck object, because the deck object should always be there if the player object is in the room. In order to do that, I'm going to create another keyboard condition. So the key I'm going to use for this is the escape button. And the function you want to use to restart the game is simple. It's just game restart. Now, if I press the play button, I can draw some cards, and if I hit the escape button, it restarts. Now this will be good for whenever we start going into more in-depth programming. So, let's continue. So, now what we want to do is create a new object. So if we want to make an animation for a single card and not the other cards, the easiest way to do that is to create a singular card object. So we're going to create a new object, and we're going to call it object card. And we are going to set the sprite to the back of a card, because that will be the initial sprite of the object. But before we start animating the object, I want to make sure we're actually drawing the card from the deck. And in order to do that, I'm going to create a draw event and create the line of code if card num is greater than 0. The sprite index equals the corresponding sprite in the sprite array. This will change the default sprite to this new sprite. Since we are calling variables in the draw event, we need to initialize them. So now let's initialize all the variables we will use for this object. So we're going to need the sprite array, so we're going to initialize that. This is a script we created, I believe, in the first video. We're going to create the variable card drawn. So this will be true whenever we draw the card, and that will be set to false whenever the animation is complete. And then we're going to create the card in hand variable. This will be true whenever the card drawn variable turns to false, because when we create it, this variable will be true, and then this variable will be false. And then whenever this animation is completed, this will turn to false and this will turn to true. We're going to need this in order to make the card behave like we want it to. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to tie this object to the player object. So we're going to do the same thing that we did in the deck object. Create a player variable and set it equal to the object player. The card that's drawn is going to have a card number. It's going to have a hand position. It's going to have an X position, a Y position, and then a variable, an X variable that we're going to move it to, and a Y variable that we're going to move it to. We're also going to reinitialize the card width and the card height. So now we have this object card created, but we have nothing bringing it into the room of our game. So where we want to do that is in the draw script, because that's where this should be created. So we're going to go to our draw event and we're going to manipulate this code to create a field card. So in order to do that, we want to create the following line of codes. So we are going to create an object. So we're going to create a card object for each card in our hand, and we're going to want to maintain those variables, or we're going to want to maintain those objects. And the way to do that is to initialize them to a variable. So we're going to have a hand card variable for every hand position we have. Now we're going to set that hand card variable equal to the instance we're going to create for that card object. And then we're going to use the following function to create that. So what we want to do before we move any further is add this variable initialization to the player hand. So we're going to go to our object player. Where we initialized our hand, we're going to add this to this for loop. So we have one of these variables created for each hand position. So now we're going to go back, and for the position we want it to go into, it's got to change depending on how many cards we have in our hand. So when we draw a card, we're incrementing our hand by 1. So that's going to happen before whatever we do down here. So if we have 0 cards, we want the first position to be 0. But if we draw a card, we're going to increment it from 0 to 1. So if I just put hand count here, I will never be able to create one for the 0 position because it's incremented before I created this object. So in order to combat that, I'm going to do hand count minus 1 because it's going to be the hand count before we incremented it. Now I could move this after the line of code, but I'm not, just so I can keep everything the same from the previous videos. And so you can kind of understand the things you have to look out for when you're programming your own game. But now we want to finish this function call. So if you look at the bottom, this is looking for an X position, a Y position, the depth, and the object we want to create. So what we're going to do is we're going to put it at our deck X, our deck Y. The depth we want to be the lowest depth will show above everything else. So what we want to do is make each hand card that we draw on a lower depth than the one previous. So we're going to make it a variable dependent on our hand count. And we're going to say hand count -2. And then the object we're going to create is the object card. This line of code will create that object, but we need to change the variables that we initialized in that object to be unique to the card we just drew. So, in order to do that, we're going to use this with function again. We're going to put the same hand card we just created, and within that, we're going to say card drawn is equal to true because we just created it. We're going to say the hand position is equal to player.handCount -1 to match this code right here. And we're using this because in the initialization we created this variable to equal the object player. So this will connect this object with the player object. Then we're going to set the card number equal to player.hand position. And this should be all we need in order to draw a card from our deck. So let's see if we draw a card. So if I select this deck, it should create a card object on the deck with the sprite of the card. And it didn't. This is because I need my depth to be a negative number. Since I didn't put that negative before the hand count, it's drawing the deck on top of the card I drew. So that's why it's important to know about the depth and choosing the right depth for your object. So if I select this now, it still doesn't work. So another reason why this isn't working is in the draw event of the card, I did not put the function draw self. So before, this object was being created, but it wasn't told to show itself. And you cannot forget this line if you want it to be seen in the room. So now let's see if we can get this card to appear. So the card that I draw that will be shown on top of my deck should match the card that's in my hand. As you can see, I drew a Bulbasaur, and then I drew a Charmander, and then I drew a Squirtle. So now that we have this created, we no longer need to show this hand. So now what we want to do is, when we draw a card, have it move to the right position. So in order to do that, we want to create a path for the card to follow. So in order to do that, we need to create a path. So before we do that, what I want to do is create a step event. And in that step event, if the card is drawn, utilize alarm 0. I don't believe we've gone over alarms yet, but an alarm is pretty much just a timer. So if you want something to be done in a certain amount of frames, or time, if you can convert frames per second into seconds or minutes, you would want to use an alarm. So what this line of code is saying is if the alarm 0 isn't being utilized, as in the timer is at -1, which is its default state, set the alarm to be 1. Now, if I create an alarm, what that will do is, after this many frames, which I chose to be 1, it will do whatever code is in this alarm. So what I want to put in this alarm is the card in hand variable is equal to true. The card drawn variable is equal to false. And I want to start a path. But I need to create a path first. So in order to create a path, I need to go to my room, create a path. If you look here, it says create new path layer. And then in my workspace, I want to go to paths, right click, create path. So now in order to create the path, we want to choose 2 points on our room. We want to choose 2 points in our room for the card to follow. So I'm going to drag the path into the room on the layer path, on the paths layer, and I'm going to select the start point and an end point. Now this isn't the exact position I want it to be, but I can change that over here. So first I'm going to change the name to deck draw path, and I'm going to change the first X and Y variables to match the deck positions. And I'm going to change the second to where I want it to end, which is going to be at 320 and 917. And I can click this button to see the path in this window. So now with this path created, I can go back to my alarm 0, use this path start event, and type in what the function needs in order to work. So the first thing it's going to need is a path. So we called ours deck draw path. We want the speed to be 15. And then the end action, we'd want the path to stop. So we're going to use this GameMaker variable. And then we want to follow it, and then we want to set the last variable to false. And if you want to know what these variables mean, you can center select it, and it will show you all of the arguments and what they're used for. So we set this equal to false because we want the card to follow the path starting from wherever it begins, wherever the card is, instead of where you see it here in the room. So even though this is kind of not how we want it to move, since we set this equal to false, it will start wherever the card is in the room. Now let's see what happens when we have all of this in our code. So if I hit the play button, when we draw a card, we should see the card move from the deck to out of the room. So if I select this button, we can see the card move. Now, we don't see it going to its proper position. That's because we only created the path from the deck to out of the screen. So in order for it to move from out of the room back to its proper position, we need to create the following line of code. So if the card in hand is equal to true, which means the card has been drawn and is now in our hand, we want the X position to be equal to, if you remember, in the player event, when we draw our hand, we have these lines of code. We draw the sprite at X position plus this value. So what we want in our card object is we're going to copy this because this is equal to the X position, and then add the extra equation from our draw event, which is this. Because as you can see, it says X position plus these values. So we're also going to copy that to here. Now, I is not a part of this event. Instead of I, we're going to use the hand position because that's what I represents in that object. So, now we've created the proper X position of where we want the card to be. Now we have to move the card from its current position to its proper position. So in order to do that, we are going to use the following GameMaker functions. And the first one is point distance. So what this does is it takes two coordinates and determines the distance between those two. So what I mean by that is, say if I put these coordinates for this dot here, and then these coordinates for this dot here, it will tell me the length between the two dots. So now if that distance is greater than 10 pixels, we want to move the object towards the proper point. And in order to do that, we're going to use the move towards point function. Now what that needs is an X position, a Y position, and a speed. Now you can choose however fast you want. You can make it 20, you can make it 5, you can make it 1, but if you change the speed here, you have to change this value to match that value. So what this says is if the current position of the field, what this says is the current position of the card, which is X and Y, is not the position it should be at, which is X position and Y position, move towards that point. But all that does is move the card. If I leave it like this, what it will do is just move towards the point and then move forever. So let me show you what that will look like. So if I draw a card, it doesn't work. That's because I took variables from the player object and used them in a different object where they don't belong. So in order to do that, I need to tie them to the proper object. So that variable is the hand count. Everything else belongs in this object. So now let's try that again. So now if I draw a card, you see it's moving towards this point and it's bouncing back and forward. That's because we're not stopping it. So in order to stop it, we have to create another line of code. So in order to stop it from moving, we need to change the speed from 10 to 0. And you can do that by just saying speed equals 0. But what we also want to do is sometimes it will stop the card not in the exact position we want it in. So we want to force that to be the proper position. So we're just going to set the X and Y to equal the position we want it to be at, just to force it so it doesn't, so no card is cockeyed. So let me show you what that does. So now when we draw a card, it should move to its proper place and stay there. And as you can see, since we have this X position as a variable, it's going to move the card itself, and we don't have to do anything for that. So now that we've done that, we want the card to be face down before it leaves the room. So in order to do that, we need to remove this line of code. So now the card will be forever face down. Now, we want it to flip once it comes back into the room. So in order to do that, we're going to create a new alarm. And it's going to be the next one. And in this alarm, we're going to say sprite index is equal to sprite array card num. So now this will force the sprite index to be the sprite of the card. So now we have to call that alarm, and we want to do that after we call the path start function. So we're going to say if alarm 1 has not been called, alarm 1 is equal to 25. So this is the number of frames that it will wait before setting the sprite index to be the sprite of the card. So now let's see if that works. As you can see, it's face down until it comes back into the field. But now that these are all being printed in their proper spaces, we should remove the additional hand printing from the object player. So I'm going to go to the object player and I'm going to delete this code. So now we're going to go back to the object card. And what I want to do now is be able to move the card wherever I want. Because that was the point of creating this object, was so that we could have each card move independently of each other. So what I'm going to use are some mouse events. So if the mouse left button is down, so when the mouse left button is down, I want to select the card. So what I want to do is create this variable called selected, and I want to initialize it to be false. So now, if selected is equal to true, the X position of this object will equal to the mouse X position, and then same with the Y position. Now, let's see what that looks like. So if I draw the card, I should be able to move it now wherever I want to move it. And since I have that line of code in my step event to move it to its proper position, if it's not in its proper position, it will move back to where it belongs. But there's still a problem with this. So let's say I have 3 cards in my hand. If I select this card, it will always remain selected. So if I select another card and I go over another card, it will begin to move them both. And I don't want that. So I can collect every single card, and I want them to move independently of each other. So that means I have to specify when I want selected to be true. So the way I do that is if the mouse check button has been pressed, and that is the left button, and the card is in its desired position, then we can select the card. So what that's doing is, since this is a left down event, if I have a card selected and I'm dragging it around, if I go into another card, since this is a left down event, it will also select that card. So the only time I want to do that is if I press down the left button on top of the card. That's what this is doing. Now, these conditions make it to where the card has to be in its natural position in order for me to select the card. So if you saw earlier in the video, I could select the card as it was dropping down to where it should be. So that will prevent me from selecting it then. So the last thing I need to do in order to make them purely independent is create two new events. The left released, which is going to set selected equal to false, and the mouse leave event selected is equal to false. So now what this says is if I release the left mouse button while on the card object, it will set selected equal to 0. It will set selected equal to false. Now, there are cases where you could move the mouse too quickly and drop the card, and it will not set the selected variable to false. So then we added this mouse leave event for if that happens, set selected equal to false. So now if we try to select multiple cards, let's see if it will allow us. So I'm going to draw 3 cards. I'm going to pick up Squirtle. As you can see, I cannot pick up multiple cards at one time. And then I can't pick up this card as it's falling. So now we don't have to worry about having too many cards moving on the field. And we've set it equal to only one card being able to move at a time. Hey guys, sorry for the interruption. I have to cut the video a little short here. It ended up being a little longer than I anticipated it to be. So I'm going to stop the video here and continue in another video and release that in a few days. If you'd like to continue to follow along, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. And if you like what you're seeing, consider leaving a like. And if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below, and I will post another video in a couple of days. Till then.